Welcome back to Sustainability Asia. My name is Nick Merritt, a finance partner based in Singapore at Norton Rose Fulbright. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mark Rathbone, a partner at PwC, also in Singapore, and the Asia Pacific lead for capital projects and infrastructure at PwC. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak.
Mark, we're seeing a lot these days on sustainability, net zero, sustainable development goals. In your role, primarily supporting governments in the region, looking at infrastructure, what are you seeing as the impact or the consequences of those drives towards sustainability in the procurement of capital projects?
Well, I think it's worthwhile just setting the scene slightly. I think the scale of the decarbonisation or sustainability challenge is very significant. Around about 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from transport networks, utility networks, water provision, and historic buildings and industry. If we want to really address the decarbonisation challenge, you've got to spend around about $6.9 trillion per annum globally to try and fix some of these issues. Our observations are in a few areas. Firstly, governments are starting to respond a bit more comprehensively to the challenge. So, for example, the US just yesterday announced that they plan to cut gas emissions by 52% by 2030, which is fantastic news. China aiming to go carbon neutral by 2060, and the EU have committed to a 55% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. That's at the government level. At a corporate level, you're seeing a very significant change in mindset. I think firstly, there's recognition from boards that there's more than just shareholder return that's at stake here. There's a far broader stakeholder requirement, but also a focus on ESG enhances brand value quite significantly. So Google, for example, have announced that by 2030, all of their campuses and data centers will be carbon neutral. That's one example. If you look at the fund pools around the world, whether it be sovereign wealth funds, the big institutions, or indeed infrastructure funds and private equity, almost all of them now are announcing that ESG needs to be at the core of all their decision making, and they will no longer be investing in carbon heavy or extraction related industries. That's all driving us to rethink the way that we approach the market. Over the course of the next sort of 10 to 15 years, we do see a large amount of investment coming into the renewable energy cycle. So solar, wind, biomass, and the rest. I think that's only one part of the challenge. Of course, power is a big contributor to greenhouse gases. So you would expect to shift towards green energy far more fundamentally. And almost all countries now have policies around that. So whether it's Thailand saying that they want 6 gigawatts of solar by 2030, or Indonesia looking at 20% of their power capacity coming from renewables over the next 20 years, all countries are starting to do that. However, there are other areas that are way, way more important, or as important, should I say. Firstly, buildings and industry needs to decarbonize. So a lot of our old historic buildings are very inefficient. They need new smart technologies to come in to improve our energy efficiency, but also better building approaches to ensure that they are more sustainable and resilient to things like climate change. Secondly, our transport networks across sea, air, road, rail, all the rest need to become a lot more sustainable. And finally, bringing in the digital solutions around that is going to be really important. Technology is playing a far bigger role in the way that we approach infrastructure delivery. And we see technology and climate change or sustainability coming together in a confluence with infrastructure in improving the way that we deliver infrastructure and operate it more efficiently in the future. Within all of those, there are some really core developments that we're starting to focus on a lot more. So things like new fuels, biofuels, biomass, and hydrogen clearly are becoming a lot more prominent in the way that we look at energy consumption. Transport networks, you've got Hong Kong MTR, who are looking to be a lot more sustainable in the future. PSA, their new port, is a sustainable port. Those networks really do need to start focusing on things like the circular economy and alternative energy sources to ensure that they are more sustainable for the future. Another part of that is, of course, things like carbon capture and carbon credits. As we all drive towards a more net zero type society, We can't eliminate carbon, but what we can do is start offsetting that through things like more robust frameworks for carbon capture, carbon credits, carbon trading, and ensuring that those are viable for the longer term. There are a couple of things that we see that need to happen in order to really deliver on the SDGs in the future. Firstly, we need to harness a lot of change in the way that we approach projects, and that's through the development of the project, the operation of assets, and then the decommissioning of assets over the life cycle. Secondly, we need to really start embedding sustainability principles across every part of our approach to infrastructure delivery, from early planning and conception all the way through to the end of the life cycle. And finally, government policy has got to change. It's got to be a lot more robust to incentivize people to have sustainability at the core of their investment thesis. So where we're approaching it from a firm is firm-wide. Every line of our service, all of our business units need to have a sustainability strategy around how they're working. And on the infrastructure side of things, that's focused on renewable energy assets, the greening of infrastructure, and sustainable finance. And those are all now very core to what we're doing in terms of both our private sector and public sector advisory capacities.
Always great talking to you, Mark, and there's clearly a lot more that we could talk about, but thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Nick. Great pleasure.